Phasing is an ability that was introduced in Mirage block, and was never directly revisited. However, phasing cards out has been used since, even if the keyword itself never actually came back. Today, we're going to go over the mechanic, why it failed, and why it was eventually returned to in a different way. To begin, how exactly does phasing work? Phasing is an ability that will make a permanent phase out at the beginning of your untapped step. At the same time, all permanents that are phased out will phase in simultaneously. A phase out permanent is treated as if it doesn't exist until it phases back in. Essentially, what the keyword does is cause a card to phase in and out each other turn, only existing every other turn cycle. However, phasing out isn't like a card being exiled and then returned to the battlefield. A card that is phased out doesn't leave the battlefield or re-enter the battlefield when it comes back. It doesn't lose things like counters, and any equipment or ores attached to it will phase out alongside it and phase in when it does, still attached to whatever phased out. It also won't cause the game to forget about things like what a clone is copying or other lingering effects. A creature with phasing will not be summoning sick if it phases in. This makes the ability a bit confusing, not because it's that hard to understand, but because the rulings become very unintuitive thanks to being very similar, but distinct to the common effect of flickering a permanent. All the rulings that affect cards leaving and enter the battlefield don't apply, but mechanically, that's the thing most similar to and the easiest analog for players to draw. Not to mention that phasing in and out happens before you untap for turn, which is typically thought of as the first thing that happens on a turn. While all of this is confusing, that confusion isn't really the reason the mechanic was abandoned. The main reason phasing as a keyword ability was only ever used in one block was simply because it was both terrible and unfun. Phasing is purely a negative ability. If a card is worth phasing, you're going to want to play it as often as possible. As such, phasing causing it to suddenly stop existing will pretty much always hurt you. Phasing was used mostly as a downside to balance out an overstated card, or at least what were supposed to be overstated creatures. Take a card like Teferi's Drake. This is a 3/2 with flying for 2 and 1 blue, which means it can't be blocked except by creatures without flying or reach. It also has phasing, which pretty much instantly makes the card terrible. It is worth mentioning that, at this time, creatures were much weaker than they are today. A 3/2 with flying alone would be fine without any sort of downsides in the modern day, but at the time, cards like Windrake were considered acceptable stat lines. Given this context, it makes a little more sense that these cards were overall far weaker than they would need to be to see play. Even with that context though, it's hard to understand why some of the cards with phasing are as bad as they are. Warping Worm is probably the poster child for bad cards with phasing. This is a 1/1 worm with a mana cost of 2, 1 green, and 1 blue. It has phasing and the ability where, during your upkeep, you have to pay 2, 1 green, and 1 blue, or it will phase out. Finally, when it phases in, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. So this is a 1/1 that, after 2 turns, will be a 2/2 that you have to pay 4 more mana to actually use. Every other turn it will grow, but this rate of growth is so slow that it's hardly worth it. You will get the counter even if you don't pay the 4 mana if you stack the abilities properly, however, and letting the card phase out during your upkeep will make it phase in next turn. That will allow it to grow faster, so its rate of growth isn't necessarily that slow. The thing is, it doesn't really matter. It's just far too much of an investment and it doesn't outpace other threats nearly fast enough to justify spending 8 mana to attack once with the worm. While Warping Worm is the most egregious weak card with the ability, most of the other options aren't much more impressive. Other rares with phasing are cards like Taniwa. This is a 7/7 legendary serpent with a mana cost of 3 and 2 blue. It has phasing and trample, meaning it can deal excess combat damage to the defending player. It also has the extra downside where, at the beginning of your upkeep, all lands you control phase out. Just phasing would have been enough to stop this card from being broken, though considering how early on it was released, it might have seen some play. 7/7s were just that rare back in the day. However, the extra downside of phasing out your lands kills any viability it could have. While not being able to cast any spells for full turn cycle every other turn is bad enough on its own, being in blue makes it even worse. Blue is most well known for its counter magic, which requires having mana up at exactly the right time. Losing all of your mana every other turn means you won't be able to defend your Taniwa, but it also gives your opponent an opportunity to develop their board knowing you can't stop them. These are the most interesting kinds of bad phasing cards, but none of them are very good. Several of them are cards like Sandbar Crocodile or Urtai's Familiar, which were slightly above rate at the time, but never all that great. Very few of the phasing cards have power greater than their mana value. And while a lot of them are blue, a color known for weak creatures, it's still surprising they made them this bad. However, even if you statted the creatures appropriately, it would still be very difficult to make phasing work. The downside on phasing is simply far too high to design many cards that work with the mechanic, and Wizards seems to have, even at the time, vastly underestimated just how bad the mechanic really was. Let's say that you cast a Merfolk Raiders. On the turn that you cast Raiders, you can't attack with it due to summoning sickness, though you could still block on your opponent's turn. However, on the following turn, it phases out, which prevents it from actually attacking or blocking at all that turn. In fact, you can't generate any value off the card at all, as any useful abilities it had just go away. On the second turn after you play the card, you can finally attack with it. The interaction with Summoning Sickness in particular makes phasing cards much weaker. Having to wait 2 turns to attack with a creature means that, even if it's slightly overstated, you'll be doing far less damage than a creature without phasing. That's not even taking into account blocking either. Your blockers suddenly disappearing every other turn will give your opponent a lot of extra opportunities to push through damage. Essentially, phasing cripples a card both on offense and on defense. Even if the card did have strong abilities, phasing is often enough to make them essentially useless. Cards like Shimmer could be used to mess with your opponent's mana, but having phasing means that your opponent will still have turns where they'll be able to play it completely unabated. Really, the only cards that you can get away with putting phasing on would be cards like Mana Flare or other combo pieces that only need to be in play for 1 turn. However, that kinda goes against the idea of phasing. Phasing is supposed to be a mechanic that punishes you over several turns, but is so punishing that it could only ever be used on a card that you only cared about being in play for a couple of seconds. That's essentially as far as the phasing keyword goes. But the phasing mechanic did see more experimentation in Mirage Block. Certain cards had the ability to phase in or phase out without the actual phasing keyword. The most common cards were cards like Mist Dragon, which allows you to pay a mana cost to phase them out. The main use for abilities like this is to dodge removal spells. This is very similar to abilities like Reaper of the Wilds, which can gain hexproof at instant speed, which prevents them from being targeted by your opponent. There are a few differences, mainly that since the creature is treated like it no longer exists, it can't block or do anything else. However, since it's not on the battlefield anymore, it can actually dodge forms of removal that cards like Reaper can't. The most common examples would be Edicts and Rats. These either force your opponent to sacrifice their creature or affect all creatures, neither of which have anything to do with targeting. This means that they'll still affect hexproof creatures as well as work against most forms of protection. Phasing is the only real way to get around these kinds of effects outside of slow flickering, which is as rare as phasing. This makes phasing cards out quite possibly the most powerful form of protection in the game. The vast majority of cards with phasing for Mirage, even the ones that didn't technically have the phasing keyword, ended up being terrible. Still, there were a couple of cards that had been used in competitive decks. The first is Reality Ripple. This is an int with the mana cost of 1 and 1 blue. It is the effect where target artifact, a creature, or land phases out. This can be used defensively to save a creature from removal or as a tempo play, but Ripple was never used in this way. Instead, it was combined with Phyrexian Dreadnought in a combo deck. This is a 1 mana 12/12 with trample and the ability where, when it enters the battlefield, you sacrifice it unless you sacrifice creatures with total power of 12 or more. However, Dreadnought can't sacrifice itself if it's phased out. So what players would do is cast Dreadnought and then cast Reality Ripple targeting it, which would basically give you a 12/12 with trample for 3 mana. This has allowed the card to see some play as part of a Stifle Knot combo deck, though it's still not as good as Stifle, simply because Stifle can be used as part of the combo for 1 less mana. Stifle Knot is okay, but it's never been really one of the top decks in Legacy, and other players will use other options over Reality Ripple. There is one other card that's seen play from this initial run, and for a very interesting reason. That card was Frentic Ifrit. This is a 2/1 Ifrit with a mana cost of 1, 1 blue, and 1 red. It has flying and the ability where you can pay 0 mana to flip a coin. If you win the flip, Ifrit phases out, but if you lose the flip, you have to sacrifice the Ifrit. While this ability is a bit inconsistent, it still makes trying to remove the Ifrit a pain. Half the time, your lightning bolt will just resolve without effect and the Ifrit will survive, while the other half of the time, the Ifrit will still die. It was going to die anyway if it was being targeted with removal. This, combined with the Ifrit's at the time on-rate stat line, made it a somewhat popular choice for blue-red decks back in its standard. Perhaps more famous is the card's interaction with the alt-win condition Chance Encounter. This is an enchant with a mana cost of 2 and 2 red. It has abilities where, whenever you win a coin flip, you put a luck counter on Chance Encounter. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if it has 10 or more luck counters on it, you win the game. Once you have both of these cards in the field, what you can do is just activate the Ifrit, then activate it in response to itself and do this over and over again, around 100 times or so. This will allow you to flip 100 coins. And though you will almost certainly lose a flip at some point and have to sacrifice the Ifrit, you'll still win at least 10 flips. Essentially, Ifrit is the easiest way to flip coins in the entire game, which can allow you to win the game almost out of nowhere with a card like Chance Encounter. These are the only two cards with this ability from Mirage that are really worth talking about, which really goes to show how weak the ability was. While this is the last time we saw the phasing keyword, Wizards has somewhat recently brought the mechanic back. While initially just a trickle of cards with the ability to manually phase cards out, slowly the mechanic went from almost entirely forgotten to something you'd see every now and then. The first card this mechanic was brought back was Teferi's Protection. This is an instant with a mana cost of 2 and 1 white. It is the effect where, until your next turn, your life total can't change and you gain protection from everything, meaning that you can't be dealt damage, targeted by, or enchanted by anything. Also, all permanents you control phase out, and then you exile Teferi's Protection. The point of this card was to essentially protect you and your board from any and everything for a full turn cycle. The combination of protection from everything and making it so your life total can't change makes it almost impossible to affect you at all, and your permanents were all phased out, preventing anything from happening to them. While 3 mana made this cost too much for most formats, in Commander, the card quickly proved itself an invaluable tool for white decks. The next card with the phase mechanic was Teferi, Master of Time, released about 3 years after Protection. This Planeswalker costs 2 and 2 blue and has 3 loyalty. Its static ability allows you to activate its abilities at instant speed during any player's turn, which also allows you to activate it once during each player's turn. So you can activate it on your turn and then your opponent's, letting you activate it twice per turn cycle. The +1 lets you draw a card, then discard a card. The -3 lets you phase out target creature you don't control, and the -10 allows you to take 2 extra turns after this one. Essentially, Teferi allowed you to cycle through your deck for extra cards, and, if you needed to, phase out a threat to protect either himself or you. If you ever got the -10 ability, it was just game over, as 2 extra turns is essentially unbeatable. The card saw a good amount of play in control decks during its standard, but hasn't really made its way into any other formats besides Commander. While we're on that subject, we should probably talk about why Teferi in particular gets so many cards with phasing. In the lore of the game, Teferi is a time mage whose story is heavily connected to the time rifts. His home, Zhalfir, was stuck in one of those time rifts for years, depicted in the phasing of Zhalfir. This has led Teferi to having a strong association with the ability. Lore aside, after Master of Time, phasing would become a lot more common. Modern Horizons 2 had Out of Time, a board wipe that would phase creatures out until it left the field and put itself on a clock based on how many creatures were in play. In the very next set, Dungeons & Dragons Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, there were 3 cards that phased out. Blink Dog had the ability to phase themselves out, similar to old cards like Mist Dragon. Divine Smite was a removal spell against black cards that was able to just phase out anything else, and Guardian of Faith could phase out your entire board to save them from removal. More and more cards have trickled out since then with the ability to phase out cards, like Slip Out the Back and Clever Concealment. This leads to a pretty natural question. Why did they decide to bring phasing back? Well, phasing has a number of notable upsides and downsides from a design perspective. The main upside is being able to essentially slow flicker a card without causing a card to change zones. As we previously discussed, there are a lot of specific interactions that come up considering the minutia between flickering and phasing out a card. Before Teferi's Protection, Wizards printed out cards like Ghostway and Eerie Interlude to allow you to exile your entire board and return them to the field at the end of your turn. In a way, this is very similar to cards like Protection, which phases them out. However, the difference in rulings makes them better and worse in certain situations. If you're playing cards like Siege Rhino with Enter the Battlefield triggers, you'll get another instance of their abilities when they come back. This makes these cards extremely powerful in these kinds of decks, if a bit slow. However, just about any other type of deck will actually prefer to phase their own cards out. If your deck is based on counters, then exile them and returning to the field will make them lose all their counters, and you'll have to restart and build up your cards. It's also bad for auras or equipment-based decks, as all their equipment will fall off. As a result, in these decks, flicker-based protection is actually quite bad. However, this synergy with Enter the Battlefield-based effects is so powerful that flickering, as an effect, must be made more expensive to compensate. Cheap flickering has repeatedly shown itself to be incredibly strong. For a good example, look at a card like Ephemerate. For 1 white, this card essentially lets you flicker a creature you control twice. This has been strong enough to allow Ephemerate to see play as far back as Legacy, at least occasionally. If this merely phased out creatures, it wouldn't have had nearly the impact of the metagame that Ephemerate had. So the rules baggage that flickering has and potential power level on the right kind of decks makes phasing cards out a great alternative to flickering from a design perspective. If you want a card to just be used to protect your cards, it's a lot easier to just make it phase cards out instead of flickering them. Not to mention these intricacies between fast and slow flickers. While this does make phasing cards out an attractive option, it still has a number of issues. Namely, all the unintuitive rulings we mentioned at the beginning of the video. Teaching players the difference between these two very similar seeming effects can leave them confused. However, outside of complexity, there isn't a direct issue with phasing as a mechanic. Phasing is a weird part of Magic's design. The initial keyword it was tied to was so horrible that it's never been returned to, but found second wind as a mechanic completely unrelated to the initial ability. Phasing's high complexity has made wizards seemingly reluctant to use it until recently, though it doesn't look like the mechanic is going anywhere anytime soon. Alright, and that's the video. If you have any ideas for future videos just like this one, please let us know down in the comments below.